Today, as many of you know, is the vernal equinox. And for that matter, within the last 5 minutes, we entered springtime because it arrived at 5:58 p.m. just now. It was like 6:03 on my watch. Thus, it becomes a felicitous time to hear from our speaker tonight. He is Michael Kazin, who will talk to us about the history of the Democratic Party, voila, and how it started in the early republic and how it has evolved over the years, and what trends have affected it. It can be hard to track. So when I last counted, there are currently 18 Democrats who've announced that they're running for president, and 19 if Joe Biden has announced since I started talking. The first two presidential televised debates of any kind, will be in June and July, right around the corner. And to a historian like Michael, who specializes in U.S. politics and social movements in the 19th and 20th centuries, there's nothing new about this state of affairs. To paraphrase William Faulkner, the past isn't dead, it's not even past. A professor in the Department of History at Georgetown since 1999, Michael is visiting the Institute this year as a Friends of the Institute member of the School of Social Science. He's the author of 6 award-winning books about American history. Most recently published was War Against War, The American Fight for Peace, 1914-1918, which received an editor's choice from the New York Times Book Review. One of his early ones, which I ordered because I just wanted to read it, The Populist Persuasion in American History, was recently reissued with the rise of sort of international populism. He's also the co-editor of Dissent, a legendary magazine and one of America's leading intellectual journals of the Democratic left, founded in 1954. He's the recipient of fellowships from the Guggenheim Foundation, the National Endowment for the Humanities, the Woodrow Wilson Center, and twice from the Fulbright Scholar Program. He grew up in New York City and New Jersey, I hope I have that right, and was educated at Harvard and Stanford, and he lives in the Adams-Morgan section of the District of Columbia with his wife, who is a physician. Please welcome me in welcoming Michael Kazin.
Thank you, Lenny, and thanks to the Friends for helping to bring me here this year, and this wonderful institute. Thanks you, and I hope you are able to partake of all the glorious intellectual gifts this place has to offer. Also want to thank Pamela Hughes, who invited me, originally at least, to give this talk. I told Pamela at the time that her name sounded familiar, New Jersey, because when I was 17 years old, I think it was, I was chair of Bergen County Young Citizens for Hughes when he ran for re-election as governor. And I don't remember doing anything really besides going to a few meetings of people who couldn't vote yet and telling them why their parents should vote for Hughes. So, but I had, I could use that on my college applications. So, as you know, college applications are sometimes, let us say, not exactly genuine. Anyway, I don't want to get into that one. I should say at the start that what I'll be talking about is very much a work in progress. My last book came out 2 years ago, and I started working on this one around the same time. And for historians, especially when you're writing about a topic like the Democratic Party, which has existed for over 200 years, it takes a lot more than 2 years to write the book. So what I'm giving you is a very much sort of a provisional set of ideas and narratives about the Democratic Party. And like most historians, I'm approaching the subject by writing a narrative guided by certain ideas, which I hope will be both useful and significant to those who read it. One of my favorite phrases about how to write good history is by the Harvard historian Jill Lepore, who some of you might read in the New Yorker. And Jill has said, "To write history is to make an argument by telling a story. And that's what I'm going to try to do in the book and what I'll try to do today as well. So what's my story? And what arguments am I trying to make? Well, I'm framing the narrative around two intersecting themes with an argument that I hope ties them together. The first theme is the shifting demographic makeup of the Democratic constituency. Who voted for Democrats? Who was active in working for Democrats? And as part of that, the party's unwillingness for a long time and inability at other times to unite wage earners and small farmers across racial lines. What used to be called the coalition of the producing classes, a 19th century term that maybe should be brought back. When Democrats were able to unite the producing classes across racial lines from the 1930s through the 1960s, they dominated American politics. Historians call this period the New Deal order period. And it's still looked on, romantically in some ways by Democrats today. I'm sure you've noticed that the very rather radical environmental plan that some left-wing Democrats have put forth in this new Congress, they call it the Green New Deal, because the New Deal has such a resonance for Democrats and progressives generally. This is a sense which I don't expect you to absorb entirely, but it shows the times when Democrats dominated American politics, dominated presidential elections at least, and when they didn't. And of course the blue is when they did and the red is when they didn't. But since the start, Democrats have struggled to define which people they represent. The Democrats used to call themselves the party of the people, but clearly they weren't the party of all the people. No party can be, in a democratic society anyway. And they've struggled to define which people they both represented and which people they wanted to represent. And this struggle about which people are going to be Democrats has been central to much else the party's managed to accomplish, I think, ideologically, structurally, and electorally, and in terms of what policies they're able to enact when Democrats get into power. That's one theme, then. Who are the people? How can Democrats attract a majority of them? Second theme, I think Democrats did best in national politics and the politics of most states as well, and they had the most loyal followers when they could articulate a vision of what I would call moral capitalism and policies designed to achieve that end. Policies which appealed to the broadest number of people who work for somebody else or who own small businesses. Now, what do I mean by moral capitalism? Well, I get the term from a book by a friend of mine, Elizabeth Cohen, which won a lot of prizes when it came out in 1990, called Making a New Deal, which was her attempt in a very serious, profound way to explain why working people in Chicago who had not, for the most part, voted for Democrats before the 1930s, all of a sudden started voting for Democrats overwhelmingly. And she argued it was partly because Democrats put forth a vision of what she called moral capitalism. Her definition at the time was rather abstract. She said moral capitalism was a form of political economy that promised everyone, owner or worker, a fair share. What did that mean in the 1930s? In the 1930s, a fair share meant a modest redistribution of wealth through higher wages, secured by strong labor unions, and a desire for the federal government to, quote, police capitalism, so workers would really get the New Deal they deserved. That's Cohen's language, not mine. The term has been resurrected recently. I was happy to note because I decided to use it before it got resurrected by the guy on the right. If you didn't recognize the name, you might be able to guess what family he comes from, just the way he looks. This is Joe Kennedy III, congressman from Massachusetts, grandson of Robert Kennedy. Robert Kennedy had many grandchildren, many children. Kennedy has adapted Cohen's term to pose solutions to our current state of inequality in this country. For Joe Kennedy III, quote, moral capitalism means a system judged not by how much it produces, but how broadly it empowers, backed by a government unafraid to set the conditions for fair and just markets. I think moral capitalism is a useful term to describe how, not just in the 1930s, not just now, but throughout the history of the Democratic Party, Democratic leaders, key democratic activists, have both found fault with the way the American economy works and proposed ways to reform it, to give more resources and more power to ordinary Americans. It's useful as an abstract vision, the way Joe Kennedy describes it, the way Elizabeth Cohen described it, and in more specific ways, animating specific policies. If you think about it, powerful political terms that do resonate with people tend to have both characteristics. They sound good abstractly, and you can group a lot of policies that are useful and popular policies very often underneath that rubric. So I think there's a thread that stretches in the history of the party from Andrew Jackson's war against the Second Bank of the United States in the 1830s, which I'll talk more about soon, to Grover Cleveland's attack on the protective tariff in the 1880s, to William Jennings Bryan's crusade against the money power in the 1890s, to Franklin Roosevelt's assault on economic royalists in his 1936 campaign. And it's come alive again, moral capitalism has, I think, in the party since the Great Recession of 2008, 2009. Whether in Barack Obama's statement in 2011 that this is, quote, a make or break moment for the middle class, or in Bernie Sanders' attacks on billionaires and his calls for much stricter regulation on corporations and a much higher minimum wage. Or for Elizabeth Warren, over there on the left, of course, who calls for seats for workers on corporate boards. As Warren puts it in a really wonderful sort of quintessence of moral capitalism, I support markets, Warren says, but markets without rules, that's corruption. That's capture of our government by the richest and most powerful around us. Corruption, a quintessentially moral term, if there ever was one, but public corruption, not corruption of one politician stealing money from the public treasury, though she's against that too, I assume. In all these iterations, moral capitalism would be a system that balanced protection for the rights of property owners and employers with an abiding concern for the welfare of men and women of little or modest means, who increasingly in American history have worked for somebody else rather than for themselves. Now, this is quite different from socialism, obviously. Democrats who articulated a vision of moral capitalism sought to assemble a coalition behind that vision, a coalition of farmers, workers, more and more intellectuals as well, understood most voters in America, most American citizens, like the idea of a market economy, basic to any definition of capitalism. But they wanted a fair chance to rise within that moral economy and felt the economy often failed to work as its defenders promised that it should. So creating such an ideology of moral capitalism and a coalition animated by it proved, I think, to be the most fruitful strategy the Democrats have used over time, despite all the changes that have taken place in the United States over the past 2 centuries. So in other words, I'm making an argument of what historians call continuity as opposed to discontinuity. There's a lot of discontinuity as well, which I'll get to. But you might say discontinuity in the continuity. That's about as abstract as I'll get. Now, defining what moral means in terms of party politics is not simple or straightforward. Of course, morality is more typically defined, as I mentioned before, in personal terms: abuse of power, sexual abuse, corruption by individuals. But the discourse of politics, if you think about it, is intensely bound up with ideas of morality, of moral behavior, of the state, of the private economy, of those who run the private economy, run the state, and run major interest groups in the society as well. And there's a constant thread in American history, which I wrote about in my book on populism, which Lanny very kindly mentioned, between the ideals of America, the ideals of moral capitalism, if you will, that the American economy should work equally for everybody or should give everyone an equal chance to rise, and the obvious fact that that hasn't worked very often for most Americans. And so the ideology, the language of populism, praising the large majority who feel ripped off, exploited by a small elite, has been a current in American history, both on the left and the right, and certainly in the Democratic Party. Well, how did this work out in practice? Now I will stop talking in large terms and try to figure out how these two themes, what kind of constituencies Democrats had and tried to attract, and the common thread of moral capitalism worked throughout the history of the Democrats over the last 200 years. And by the way, for those who are thinking, what about Jefferson? You know, didn't Jefferson found the Democratic Party? We can talk about that in the question period if you want. Jefferson certainly was seen by Democrats after his time as the founder of the modern Democratic Party. But in fact, the Democratic Party, which is actually called the Democratic Republican Party during Jefferson's lifetime, was a very small, rather elite group. And it was really more a party of notables than it was a party of mass participation in any way. So that's why I'm beginning my book in the 1820s, when you do have, for the first time in most states, universal white manhood suffrage. Most white male adults could vote, which was the first country in world history, by the way, where that was true. And also we had a permanent party apparatus in most states that ran and expected to run in competitive elections against other parties. And so that was something new, I think, in American history, and in many ways in world history as well. To the founders of the Democratic Party, Andrew Jackson and Martin Van Buren, who was really more successful as a party builder than he ever was as president. Now, historians don't have much good to say about the 19th century Democratic Party these days. If you read anything about the Democratic Party today, it's seen as a party of, racism, Indian removal, on and on and on. My friend, the journalist Michael Tomasky, who some of you might read in the New York Times or the Daily Beast, has a new book where he has a chapter entitled "The Pre-FDR Democrats, a Horrible Party." Well, what are its sins? Well, I mentioned them, a couple of them already. They're probably familiar to most of you who know anything about 19th century American history. The Democrats carried out the removal of Cherokees from their ancestral lands in Georgia to Indian territory in what became Oklahoma, Trail of Tears. Many people died on the way. Democrats defended slavery. Democrats backed the expansion of slavery. It was a Democratic president, of course, James K. Polk, who started and won the Mexican War, taking away about half of Mexico's territory. Democrats opposed federal efforts to finance highways and railroads. Democrats tried to sabotage Reconstruction. Democrats were a bastion of Jim Crow, and Democrats were the builders of corrupt urban machines. A horrible party, you might say. But at the same time, Democrats in their first century, from the 1820s through the 1920s, were also a party that espoused a ideology, set of programs which I think fit under the rubric of not just moral capitalism, but what three political scientists in a recent book Princeton University Press published call egalitarian whiteness. Egalitarian whiteness. And it's that ideology and the policies which embodied it that defined the Democrats in many ways for over a century. Excising, doing away with the racial supremacist, the racist part of that phrase, getting away from the whiteness part, required a very long and arduous struggle. What about this first period, the antebellum period? When, by the way, until the late 1850s, when the Democrats began to break up, Northern Democrats versus Southern Democrats, the Democrats were the majority party in America. And it's true for most majority parties, they were a rather unlikely coalition. They brought together working class radicals from Manhattan, the first unionists in America, with Southern planters who owned hundreds of slaves. They won votes from white subsistence farmers and from merchants whose warehouses bulged with goods from Europe. Most of the native-born Americans who worshipped at well-established Episcopalian churches were Democrats, but so are most Catholics, the majority of whom have been born abroad. And one of the core constituencies of the Democratic Party at the time were Irish Catholics, especially from the famine generation, coming here in the 1840s and the 1850s. This is obviously a hostile depiction of the Irish as the rulers of the Democratic Party, and this is drawn by the great cartoonist Thomas Nast, who had many great virtues, but religious tolerance was not one of them. One side of the breadth of the Democratic coalition in the 1840s and early 1850s was that both these men were ardent Democrats, Walt Whitman and Jefferson Davis. The vagabond gay poet edited a party organ in Brooklyn, spoke at mass rallies, and wrote beautiful odes to Andrew Jackson. While the future president of the Confederacy, Jefferson Davis, canvassed in Mississippi, his home state, for Democratic presidential nominees and ran for a seat in the House of Representatives and later won a seat in the Senate. The only potential constituency that party officials and activists made no effort at all to attract were, of course, African Americans. And this was not just because white planters were Democrats. Many white planters were actually Whigs as well. In fact, the richest white planters were very often Whigs, the opposition party in the 1830s, 40s, and part of the 50s. But one of the reasons why so many white workers in the North were Democrats was because they were afraid of abolition. They were afraid of racial competition coming from slaves being freed in the North, coming to compete with them for jobs. Also, urban merchants and manufacturers were opposed to abolition and were Democrats in many cases because they were doing a fine business supplying southern plantations with clothing, machinery, and luxury goods. Also, Democrats believed that their opponents who pushed abolitionism, who pushed women's rights, who pushed all manner of reforms in society which were not about uplifting white working people, were fanatics. This is an example of an anti-abolitionist handbill from Poughkeepsie, New York, which was a Democratic bastion at the time, where Vassar College is today. And it gives you some sense of the kind of outrage that many white Democrats had about those who wanted to radicalize society to help anybody but the core of the people who made up the society, who were, after all, white people of little means. One example of this anger could take sometimes eloquent form. 1844, there was an ardent Jacksonian who published a brief satirical story that expressed this worldview. Describe the story a little bit for you. Out on a western prairie, gather a vast assemblage of reformers who cast an assortment of once cherished items into a massive bonfire. They throw into the flames military medals, barrels of liquor, Bibles, Shakespeare's plays, love letters, and more. All that nonsense is done away with, exults a rude figure who scorns a defender of tradition for lording it over his fellows. The dismayed narrator calls this Earth's Holocaust. These are true believers who believe all the past must be wiped away to achieve the perfect order that they seek. Who wrote this story, do you know? Anybody guess? One of the most famous novelists in American history. Nathaniel Hawthorne. Whoops. I went by it. Oh, what happened to it? Whoop. Sorry. This is earlier version of the PowerPoints was loaded instead of the one that I thought was going to be loaded. Not to worry. Anyway, it was written by Nathaniel Hawthorne, of course, well known for writing The Scarlet Letter and other great books. Nathaniel Hawthorne, like many intellectuals at the time, in fact, was an ardent Democrat. In fact, so ardent a Democrat, he wrote a campaign biography for Franklin Pierce in his victorious 1852 election campaign. Well, what about moral capitalism? Well, here, get to the slides I do have here. It was held together ideologically by the vision of an economy in which every white man had an equal opportunity to rise. At the time, Democrats believed that the federal government, a strong federal government, was actually a barrier to that. Later on, as we'll see, Democrats change their mind and believe that a strong federal government will help average people get equal opportunity or close to equal opportunity. But in the 19th century, up until the 1890s, actually, Democrats believed that the government would always be controlled by the rich and well-to-do. It always had been in Europe. They thought there was no reason why that wouldn't be true in the United States. And in many ways, the prime specimen of this worldview that the government, a strong federal government, will always help the rich and well-born, the elite, to enrich themselves, was the Second Bank of the United States, which Andrew Jackson, when he was president, he vetoed a bill to recharter that bank. He believed the bank was just helping to finance the projects of friends of the bank, which was not really true, but he was able to make that argument. You see here, then he's running off the bank, and notice the bankers have dark faces, which of course they didn't have either. And his rhetoric was, I don't want to say Trumpian, but certainly it was direct, as you see from this slide. He thought the bank was trying to kill him, and in fact he was trying to kill it, and he succeeded in killing it. So slaying the monster bank became the master trope for a party beginning in the 1830s that continued to energize activists about this issue, really up through the 19th century. So I won't go into the Civil War and having the Democrats then. Most of you probably know something about that. They split, of course, in two. Southern Democrats left the party and went and tried to found their own nation, and Northern Democrats fought about whether to support the Civil War or not. Most of them did, though hardly any Democrats supported the abolition of slavery. But the second period really begins in what historians call the Gilded Age. Irish Catholics who came very poor, having jobs on the streets as laborers, anywhere they could get them. By the late 19th century, some Irish Catholics had risen to become political bosses, as you know. And this is a wonderful cartoon of Tammany Hall, of course, noticed as a shamrock in the tiger's hat, with a cigar, which, of course, every good urban boss had to have a cigar sticking from his mouth, controlling Manhattan. Not just controlling it, but lying on it, stepping on it. In the late 19th century, the Democrats were a minority party nationally. They only won the presidency twice with the same man, Grover Cleveland. But they controlled, after Reconstruction ended, they controlled the South, and so they had a steady 1/3 of the electoral vote from the southern states, and they also were able to control the House of Representatives for several terms in the late 19th century. And their doctrine of racial supremacy, of white egalitarianism, of egalitarian whiteness was very useful, not just in the South or parts of the North, but also in the West, which was growing at the time. A good example of that is a party many of you probably have never heard of, the Workmen's Party of California. Anybody ever heard of that? Raise your hand if you have. No? Workmen's Party of California was a party of white workers and white unionists, which controlled the state of California for several years in the late 1870s. And it had two major goals. One was tax the railroad corporations heavily and distribute some of those taxes to programs that would help white working people and white middle-class people. The other plank was the Chinese must go. They wanted to expel, not just stop more Chinese immigrants from coming to the country, but expel all those who are here, which of course is completely unconstitutional. But they were able to get a majority of white Californians, because the only people voting at the time really, to vote for them. The party didn't last for various reasons, but it shows you how egalitarian whiteness could have appeal beyond the South, beyond the urban North, in the developing West as well. Now, gradually in the late 19th, early 20th centuries, Democrats sharpened the definition of the people to appeal to small businessmen in rural areas and the cities who felt squeezed by industrial corporations and high finance. They began to talk about the monopolies, the money power. And they began slowly but surely to change their view about the powers of government, to argue that, in fact, liberty, freedom should mean the freedom for government to help people, not just the freedom from government controlled by a financial and economic and well-born, well-educated elite. And a key moment in this change, I hope this is, no, sorry, this is earlier slides were loaded by mistake. Here we go. Was the 1896 election. I wrote a biography of William Jennings Bryan, so I have a certain affection for this election and for Bryan himself, despite his many sins, political sins, not personal ones. 1896, Bryan ran on a campaign of actually empowering the government to help ordinary white people. He argued that there needed to be inflation of the money supply to help debtors get out of debt. He argued there needed to be a bill to legalize labor unions and help labor unions be able to sign up members without being harassed by courts, which many of them were at the time. As you see here, in this slide, he's opposed to the Republican Party boss, a guy named Mark Hanna, senator from Ohio at the time, in the checkered shirt, checkered with dollar signs, to coerce industrial workers to vote for Republicans. There were, in 1896, some employers who basically said, if you vote for Bryan, don't come to work on Monday if he wins, because I don't want this crazy economic radical to run the country. So this was an important change for the Democratic Party. And in many ways, the Democratic Party has never actually gone back to the older idea that the government should be, the federal government especially, should be as powerless as possible. So let's jump to the third period. Again, hold on. This, of course, the New Deal era, the New Deal order period, as I mentioned before, was the second period of democratic dominance, as in the 1830s to 1850s. And like the first one, a century before, Democrats in this period were based on a broad coalition of workers and farmers, drawn from all regions, and a variety of ethnic and social clusters. Of course, the U.S. was both much larger and more diverse ethnically than during Jackson's time. The New Deal coalition included new demographic groups the Democrats had never appealed to seriously or had spurned during the previous century, including African Americans, including female reformers. Eleanor Roosevelt, before she was First Lady, was part of a very vigorous and effective network of female reformers, settlement house workers, suffragists, anti-child labor campaigners who really invigorated the Democratic Party with what we might call a welfare state mentality. And of course, also new working class immigrants and their children from Eastern and Southern Europe, who would come in large numbers only in the early 20th century. And many of these people, these workers, became the core of a very important Democratic constituency group, which had never really been important before, which was organized labor. Also, for the first time in the 1930s, the Democrats become the default party of people like me, most academics, and cosmopolitan intellectuals. This was quite a change from the 19th century, when Democrats, except for people like Whitman and Hawthorne and a few others in the 1840s and 50s, but after the Civil War, the Democrats had a kind of lowbrow, disreputable image among intellectuals, most of whom were white Protestants at the time. William James, for example, supported William Jennings Bryan in 1900, but he said, I like Bryan, but I can't stand his followers. In fact, he used more earthy language than that, actually. Now, it was also true that more and more intellectuals were of immigrant background themselves. Many were Jewish, at least in New York and other big cities like that, and that had an impact on the Democratic Party as well. It made it a much more ethnically pluralist party. But the CIO was crucial. Many of you probably know what the CIO was. It was the Congress of Industrial Organizations, which organized unions in the major industries in America for the first time, really. Steel industry, auto industry, meatpacking industry, textile industry. And it was unusual because labor unions before the 1930s were usually all white or sometimes had some Mexican-American workers. There were some separate black unions in parts of the South, but basically unions were basically closed officially or unofficially to African-Americans. This changed with the CIO. The CIO, as you see from this CIO poster, was explicitly interracial. And the fact it was interracial, and the fact that the CIO saw the New Deal, saw Franklin Roosevelt, saw the Democratic Party, despite the fact that it still had, very strong roots in the South, as a party which was going to help them organize unions, get Social Security, be able to get people on relief, get jobs for people through the Progress and Works Administration, the WPA, and other New Deal agencies. So even before the Democratic Party has done away with its racist past officially, which didn't really happen until 1948, in the 1930s, the CIO unions are pushing the Democrats, if they want to get help from the CIO, to shelve its racist past. And this, by the way, is one of the things which very early on, late 1930s, provokes a beginning of a split between Southern Democrats and other Democrats. Many people think it started in the 1960s with the Civil Rights Act. It started much earlier. I don't want to take too much longer. So oops. Oh, here's Adam Clayton Powell Jr., who was a leader of black Democrats, and actually the first Democratic congressman who was African American, elected in 1944. Let me get to the fourth period, so I can conclude and give you a chance to ask questions, which is what I'm always most interested in, really. The fourth period of the history of the Democratic Party, which in many ways has not yet ended, is marked by another change in the Democrats' constituency, and I think a diminution, until recently, of the importance of talking about moral capitalism, which is one reason I think why the Democrats have not done as well, for the most part, since the 1960s. At least have not been a dominant party since that point. You can say that the Democrats, since the 1970s, have been, in most elections, a dumbbell alliance. I don't mean that means they were stupid, but a dumbbell has a piece of metal on one hand and a long thread in the middle. The thickest part of the Democratic coalition have been people who are usually comfortable economically, pretty well educated, at least have college educations, live in places like New York and Princeton and Denver, university towns, big cities on the one hand, and on the other hand, some of the poorer people in America, African Americans, many recent Latino immigrants. So dumbbell alliance. In the middle, of course, was the traditional constituency of the Democratic Party, which is white working people who have been leaving the Democratic Party slowly but surely over the last few decades. Who is the Democratic constituency today? Well, I don't have to spend much time talking about it because all of you pretty much know. It's one that was bolstered by the ideas and activism of what historians call the new social movements, which are not new anymore. Feminist, LGBT, racial justice, environmental. Groups that Nathaniel Hawthorne, way back in the 1840s, would have called fanatics. But now they're in many ways the base of the Democratic Party. At least they turn out the most activists at campaign time. Here's George McGovern, 1972, saying together with McGovern and showing MICE multinational, multicultural, multi-class constituency, which of course didn't exactly come to fruition when he lost in one of the greatest landslides in American electoral history. I was going to talk about example, well, maybe I'll do it quickly before ending, of how one of the reasons why working people no longer are the base of the Democratic Party when they once were in the 1930s and 40s and 50s and even into the 1960s. Some people say, well, it's because working people are anti-immigrant or they're racist. And some of that might be true depending on who you're talking about. But something very important that gets missed, I think, in that discussion is the power of working class institutions. Let's take West Virginia, for example. When the United Mine Workers was the largest working class institution in West West Virginia was one of the most democratic states in the Union. If you watched election night in West Virginia, November, really up until the 1990s, West Virginia got called early, 5 minutes, 10 minutes after the polls closed. You know, whether for Lyndon Johnson or John Kennedy or Hubert Humphrey even, or not McGovern, he lost it, but Jimmy Carter. Michael Dukakis, nobody's idea of a working class hero. No offense to Michael Dukakis, a very fine man, won West Virginia by almost 10 percentage points. What percentage did Donald Trump win it by in 2016? Anybody know? 43%. So how to explain that? Well, important way to explain, I think, is the coal economy in West Virginia collapsed, even though President Trump is trying to bring it back. Hard to do all by yourself, especially when coal is not very profitable, but that's an aside. When the United Mine Workers was strong, it was not just strong economically, not just did win good wages and a good health plan. Hospitals, the United Mine Workers actually ran themselves in West Virginia. It also educated white working people in West Virginia to see the way the Democrats, according to the Union, helped working people through Social Security, through a strong National Labor Relations Act, through all kinds of other measures that the government provided. The United Mine Works collapsed. What happened is a lot of those people who had been members of the United Mine Workers looked to another source, another institution, to learn their politics from and to seek solace from, and that was evangelical churches. So as United Mine Workers membership shrank over the course of the last 30 years, the number of evangelical Protestant churches in West Virginia went up. And that, to me, explains not everything, but a lot about why Democrats won West Virginia in 1988 by 10 points, and Republican won West Virginia in the last election by 43 points. Well, let me conclude, so we have time for questions. Well, I want to say before that, Democrats, I think, more recently have again begun to stress the themes of moral capitalism. Joe Kennedy III is just one of them, Elizabeth Warren, Bernie Sanders. The Great Recession of 2008 and 9 was a terrible thing for most Americans, but it was very good for reviving a sense among Democrats that you have to talk about economic inequality again, you have to talk about programs to help the great majority of Americans again, and make that sort of the forefront of your message to Americans, which you really had not been for many years. So how will Democrats evolve in the near future? Well, as a historian, I'm always hesitant to make predictions. You know, I get interviewed by journalists, and they say, well, who's going to win the Democratic nomination, and what are they going to do once they win? And I said, come on. Historians can tell you why things happened in the past. We can't tell you what's going to happen in the future. But one thing is clear, I think, is that Democrats are struggling with whether to appeal to the voters they've lost, white working people especially, or to concentrate on mobilizing the coalition that they already have, that dumbbell coalition. They would argue, some of Democrats, if that coalition was enough to elect Barack Obama twice, to take back the House of Representatives in the last midterm election a few months ago, then it should be good enough to return Democrats to majority status again, particularly because demography, they argue, is on the side of the Democrats. Latino population is growing, population of Asian Americans is growing. Young people tend to be much more pro-democratic than pro-Republican. Problem with that is it doesn't address one of the key elements in politics, which is organization and how you can mobilize people. Republicans usually have a greater unity behind a right-wing ideology the Republicans have around their ideology. And as I'm sure you know, Donald Trump is enormously popular among Republicans, even though he's not that popular among anybody else. And a well-mobilized minority in politics can often defeat a less mobilized majority. And also, we're faced with something else which goes beyond my talk, but worth mentioning at the end, I think. In many ways, this is a fearful time in America, I think, despite the macroeconomy, which is doing quite well. Many people fear the nation's in decline. It's beset by foreign threats, by foreign enemies. That can be a major impetus for voters, too, whether those enemies and threats are realistic or not. That's not really the point. Perception in politics is everything. So in that environment, more people may vote their fears than their hopes. And with the two major parties roughly equal in the number of voters, who are strong Democrats and strong Republicans, most elections are and will be decided by small margins. So the future is up for grabs, but then the future always is. Thank you.